Fairy tales often get a reputation for being totally black and white. This probably has a lot to do with the fact that they are children's stories, and so often grown-ups seem to think that children's stories need to be sanitized. They think black and white is for kids, and gray areas are for adults. However, fairy tales are often filled with morally ambiguous gray areas and complicated, complex protagonists who become heroes by doing sometimes questionable or even downright unheroic things. This is especially true in the case of today's story, Faithful John. Once upon a time there was a very old king who was ill, and he knew that he was probably dying, so he summoned his faithful servant John to him. Faithful John was his favorite servant, and he was called Faithful John because he had been so loyal to the king for his entire life. He was the Sam to this guy's Frodo. John was brought before the dying king, and the king told him that he was ready to die except for the fact that he needed to make sure that his son, who was still young, would be properly taken care of. He asked John to teach his son everything that he could about being a good man and a good king, and to be his foster father until he was old enough to rule on his own. John answered that he would not forsake him and that he would always serve him faithfully even if it cost him his life. As soon as he heard this, the old king said that he was finally able to die in peace, and it wasn't long after this that he passed away. After he had been buried and his son was crowned the new king, Faithful John took the young king all throughout the castle and showed him everything that there was to know about it. All of the secret rooms, all the hidden passageways. He also assured the young king that he would keep his promise to his father and be faithful to him as long as he lived, even if it should cost him his life. The king noticed that there was one door in particular that Faithful John never opened. Inside this room there was a magnificently painted portrait of a beautiful young woman, and before dying the old king had ordered John never to let his son into this room and see the painting because he knew that if he saw it, he would faint away, become obsessed with finding the woman whose portrait it was, and would go through many dangers as a result. The young king asked John about the room, but John refused to say anything about it. Yet no matter how hard John tried to dissuade him, the king insisted and demanded so strongly, even to the point of trying to break the door to open by force, that John finally relented and went and unlocked the room and opened the door. Now the portrait was situated in the room just so that when you opened the door you had no choice but to see it. John tried to block the prince's view by getting in his way, but it was no good. The prince looked over his shoulder and immediately saw the portrait, and it was so dazzling, so gloriously, magnificently beautiful that he immediately fainted away in a swoon. As soon as he regained consciousness, the king's first words were, "Whose portrait is that beautiful picture? I will risk my life to win her!" John explained that she was the princess of the Golden Castle, and that it would be very difficult to gain an audience with her. Finally, he concocted a scheme, and he told the king to go and collect as much gold from the entire kingdom as he possibly could, hire the best goldsmiths in the land, and have them turn it all into beautiful, lifelike golden animals. He explained that the princess of the Golden Castle, as her name would imply, might be interested enough in these golden creatures to come and see them, and that thereby they might gain an audience with her. The king did everything exactly as John said, and then loaded all of the golden statues onto a ship. He and John then disguised themselves as merchants and sailed away to the kingdom where the princess of the Golden Castle was, and as soon as they made port, John went ashore and brought some of the golden treasures with him to the castle. As soon as John had gained an audience with the princess and he showed the golden treasures to her and she was delighted with them, he told her that they were nothing compared to the treasures that his master had on a ship in the harbor, which he would gladly show to her. Desperately curious, the princess went with John back to the ship where she met the king disguised as a merchant, where he showed her all of the beautifully crafted golden creatures. Meanwhile, however, John ordered the ship to be pushed off immediately and to set sail like the wind. Inside the ship, the princess spent hours and hours admiring all of the beautiful golden treasures, but never once noticed that she was being carried away from home. As soon as she went above deck, however, and saw that they were in open sea, she was terrified, thinking that she had been captured by pirates. The young man assured her that he was no pirate but a king, and that he had fallen madly in love with her when he had seen her beautiful portrait in his castle. In the fastest acting case of Stockholm Syndrome ever, the princess was apparently reassured by this and willingly consented to marry him. Now it so happened that as they were sailing onward, John was sitting in the front of the ship playing some tunes on a pipe, when all of a sudden he noticed 3 ravens flying toward the ship and landing on the mast. He stopped playing and listened to them because oddly he could understand what they were saying.
He's carrying the princess of the Golden Castle home with him. Yes, but he doesn't have her yet. Yes, he has her, but what good is that?
They went on like this until the first raven croaked that it would do no good that the king had gotten the princess, because as soon as they got on land, he would notice a great chestnut horse which he would mount immediately, but which would throw him off and kill him unless somebody else were to get onto the horse, pull the guns that were in the holsters on its saddle, and shoot it in the head immediately. The second raven croaked that he knew even more than this, that even if the horse was killed, the king still wouldn't keep his bride, because once he got back to the castle, inside he would find a newly made wedding shirt, which, although it looked like it had been woven out of silk and gold, was actually made out of sulfur and pitch, and the moment that he put it on, it would burn him to death, unless somebody got to the shirt first and got it away from the king before it burned him. Third raven claimed to know even more still, saying that when the dancing started after the wedding, the queen would go pale and fall down as if dead. Unless somebody lifted her up and drew 3 drops of blood from her right breast and spit them out again, the queen would surely die. As if all of this wasn't enough, all 3 ravens agreed that if anybody should reveal these things to the king and queen, they would immediately be turned to stone. And as soon as they had finished saying these things, the ravens flew away. John became very quiet and sad during the remainder of their voyage. He tried to rack his brains for a solution and ultimately decided that he would do whatever it takes to save the king and his bride, even if it would cost him his life. As soon as they landed, the king immediately saw a beautiful, giant chestnut horse standing on the shore and immediately wanted to get on it and ride it back to the castle. He was just about to hop into the saddle when John pushed him out of the way, got into the saddle, pulled out the rifle that was in the holster on its saddle, and shot it in the head. The king's other servants, who were not very fond of John, voiced their displeasure with this incident to the king, but the king told them that even if he didn't understand, he was sure that John had acted out of good judgment and loyalty, and told them not to bother him about it. They entered the castle, and inside the hall there stood a platter on which lay the fancy shirt. The young king went over to it and was about to grab hold of it when John pushed him out of the way yet again, grabbed a hold of it with his gloves, and threw it in the fireplace and burned it up. The other servants began to murmur against John again, but again the king told them to keep their mouths shut. After that, the wedding took place. The dances began, with the bride also taking part, and faithful John was watching everything from a corner like a hawk. Suddenly, the queen turned pale and dropped to the ground as if dead. John quickly ran to her, picked her up, and carried her out of the hall into another chamber, where he sucked 3 drops of blood from her right breast and spat them out again. Immediately, she started to breathe again and regained consciousness. The young king saw what had happened, and thinking that John was assaulting his queen, had him thrown in prison. The next morning, John was condemned and led to the gallows. Standing high on the platform and about to be executed, he proclaimed for the entire crowd to hear that anybody who is condemned to death is allowed to say one last thing, and the king granted him his request. John then explained everything that he had heard from the 3 ravens and the reason that he had acted the way that he had in order to protect the king and his queen. The king cried aloud that he was the most faithful servant in the entire world and that he should be brought down and pardoned immediately. However, as soon as John had stopped speaking, he fell to the ground lifeless and turned to stone. The king and queen were grieved terribly by the fate of their servant, and they had his stone statue carried up to their bedroom and set up by their bedside. Every time that they looked at it, they would weep and wish that there was something that they could do in order to bring him back to life. Some time passed, and the queen bore twin sons, who grew up fast and were her absolute delight. Once while the queen was at church, the 2 boys were playing on the floor beside their father, who was sitting in his room, and he was looking at the statue of John and saying aloud that he wished that there was some way that he could bring him back to life. Suddenly, the stone statue began to speak and told him that there was a way for him to bring him back to life, but it would cost him the thing that he loved most in the whole world. The king cried out to the statue that he would willingly give up everything in the world if he had it. The statue told him that if he were to cut off the heads of his twin sons and spread their blood across the stone statue, then John would come back to life. Witchcraft. The king was horrified by this, but after a moment he thought about how loyal John had been to him and how he had even died for him, and so he took his own sword, cut off the heads of his children, and spread their blood across the statue like it said. At once, the statue returned to life, and John stood before the king healthy and whole as he had ever been. John then told the king that his loyalty would not go unrewarded, and so he took the 2 heads of his sons and put them back onto their necks and they healed completely and went on playing as if nothing had gone wrong. The king naturally was overjoyed by this. He heard the queen coming back from church, and so he hid his children and John in the closet, and then he told his wife that there was a way for them to bring John back to life, but what they had to do was that they had to sacrifice their children. The queen, like the king had been, was horrified, but she also thought about how loyal and faithful John had been, and so that she agreed that they should do what the statue said. The king rejoiced to hear this and pulled John and their 2 children out of the closet and told her that everything had already happened exactly as he had said, and that everybody could live happily ever after. It's so gruesome! It's so gruesome, and it's so not normal fairy tale black and white. This is a children's story, guys. This story raises so many questions. This is one of my favorite fairy tales because it's so not normal fairy tales. So that is the story of Faithful John. I hope that you enjoyed it and are as puzzled by it as I am. If you did enjoy the story, go ahead and click that like button. Also subscribe to this channel for more stories and share it with other people that you think would like it. That is all for now, and I'll see you all next week with another story.